We're going live. It'd probably take it a second to get going. Let's see. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Dad Talk Today. I'm your host, Eric Carroll, joined as always by my man, Chris Gannon. Today, we have a special guest, Mr. Dr. Anthony Pascual Leone. Did I say that right?
Yeah, it's Antonio Pascual Leone. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, sir. He is a psychologist at Windsor University, and you've seen him on TED Talk, and I want to pick his head a little bit about what he was talking about at TED Talk. But before we do that, guys, I'd like to say a little shout out to our sponsors, the Father's Rights Movement, Isaac Law Firm, the Clock Law Firm, Upstream Growth Consultants, and the House Champ, Mr. Yahya McLean. But Dr. Pascual Leone, let me ask you a question. How did you find yourself getting into this area of practice?
Wow. Oh, that's a long right. But I mean, I'm a psychologist, so I'm a clinical psychologist. But I work at a university. I'm a professor there. I do research on psychotherapy and on emotional change. So my research is on emotion, how people change, when there's when people say, "Oh, you work through something." What does that really mean? That's what I study. What does that really mean? And how do you actually do that? And then I train therapists. I train future psychologists to, so that's what I publish on. That's what I work on. I wrote a book on trauma and co-authored this book. And right now I'm writing another book on emotional change.
And scientifically, what is emotion? What is emotion? We use that word a lot. What is emotion? Let's get the basics here.
What's emotion? Well, it's a good question. We could do it all kinds of ways, but I would probably say, emotion is a densely packaged unit of information. That's really what it is. It's so densely packaged that you're often organized in a certain way emotionally, right? You're organized by the emotion, often even faster than you're aware of what it is that I'm upset at, right? So that's one of the interesting things about emotion. I mean, when people say, "Oh, I wish I could just turn off the feelings," or "I wish I could have no feelings," that would actually make you really dysfunctional, right? So, emotion is so important that it's kind of built into the hardware, if you know what I'm saying, right? Of course, sometimes you get bent out of shape or bad things happen, and then you're organized in a certain way and you don't quite know why, or you're getting triggered in certain ways and you don't really know why. You're just kind of feeling the aftermath, or you just don't know what to do with yourself, right? So yeah, emotion can be, but it's a signal, right? It's a kind of think of it as a system that orients you to things that are not working in your life and ideally organizes you for action, right? The puzzle is sometimes you're organized more quickly than you're aware of. So densely packaged unit of information. Is that going to work?
Okay.
Yeah, so I'd like to follow up with that question and ask you, tell us a little bit, what is trauma?
All right. Good question. I think when you say trauma, most people are thinking about what in the research is called like type 1 trauma, right? You're in a car accident and now you're scared of driving. You fall out of a tree and now you're scared of gardening. I don't know, right? There's lots of single event traumas. But then there's also complex trauma. So, if you have a single event trauma, you get attacked in the middle of the night by a stranger, you get beat up, you get mugged at gunpoint. Well, that's a trauma for sure. And those are those things, you're going to have to work through that in some sense. But it's more complicated if it turns out that the person that attacked you, either emotionally or physically, I'm just using the physical example, is more dramatic, and more crisp, right? That becomes part of the puzzle here. That complex trauma is when, either there's an ongoing relationship. Think of an abusive relationship, right? That makes it complicated. And when there's a betrayal. See, like if you think of child abuse, I know that we're interested in couples here more, but if you think of child abuse, somebody who was abused as a kid, the person who you're supposed to go to for help, say the parent, if that's the abuser, then your safe haven is actually the dangerous person, right? So that's complicated, right? Car accidents, driving too fast is dangerous. That's pretty straightforward. Now we got to get over to make sure you get back on the road. But when we're talking about what is supposed to be safe is dangerous, and you see this now in betrayals, right? When you have relationships, romantic relationships, you get married, you get connected with somebody, and you kind of trust that person, and it goes sideways. Maybe even becomes predatory, not always, but I'm going to use that example. Now we're talking about complex trauma, right?
Right. Now, and where does codependency fall in between those two? Because it seems like to me, a lot of people who have experienced trauma tend to be more codependent. Like they want to help, like, for instance, they might get out of a very traumatic relationship and then go into a next one and really go into that next relationship with codependency, trying to help that other person. Can you explain that relationship between trauma and codependency a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it also depends a little bit. What's your definition of codependency, right? So there's a couple of ways one can talk about it. So I'm not sure if I'll answer the question exactly as you're wishing, but you can tell me what you mean by codependency. In any case, I mean, when somebody suffered, I'm going to say complex trauma, maybe a relationship that, one thing's breaking up, and one thing is it becomes a hostile relationship where, you feel betrayed, you feel mistreated, so now you have unfinished business, right?
Right.
The degree to which you can work that through is going to have a big impact both on who you pick next as a partner and also the success of that relationship, right? I mean, often it takes two. We all have something to do with it. It's not always the other person 100%. When you played some role in some way, right? It's not about the blame game. I'm not so interested in that. It's more about trying to get the love you need. And if you have kids, trying to make sure your kids get what they need. But there's work to be done, I think, personally. So it depends what you mean by codependency, but I mean, that's my opening answer. Does that help?
Right. Well, as far as codependency, like, personally, what I've experienced is I've, gotten out of a bad relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And feeling like that's fallen apart. Generally, a lot of people meet because they just got out of bad relationships.
Sure.
So at that point, you get into the new relationship and, your other partner is really struggling, maybe emotionally, mentally, or you might, say, oh, they're dependent upon something, a substance, addiction, because that's another thing we need to talk about, because these four kind of run hand in hand. And at some point, because things went so badly in your last relationship, you're trying to fix and help the other person that you just got with and become codependent upon that. I've not only myself have I seen myself go through that pattern in the past, but oddly enough, just watching on Facebook, I see a lot of people in our community go into relationships and, start that pattern. And granted, they fall apart very soon. But I tend to believe that due to trauma, that makes somebody who has been diagnosed with maybe PTSD or CPTSD more likely to enter a codependent relationship.
Yeah. It's tricky, right? First, I'd say, like starting a second relationship is going to be hard. It's always hard. Starting a third relationship is hard, especially when you have kind of invested. If you've put all your life, your heart and soul into someone and tried to make something work. and maybe you ended it or maybe somebody else ended it. It doesn't, I mean, yes, it matters. It makes a difference. But at the end of the day, you didn't start when you had started it, you didn't start the relationship hoping it would end. You started the relationship hoping it would go forever, right? So, so there's going to be a sense of loss and a sense of, I'm going to say in quotation marks, like failure, right? I'm not saying it's the person's fault, but you know, I've been down that path. I've been in a relationship that didn't work out, and you know, but I hoped it was going to work out. In some sense, it's that you experience that disappointment, that failure. Start having a second, you know, if we're talking about marriages or stuff, we could just go to stats, right? Like the likelihood of a first marriage working out is much higher than the likelihood of second marriage working out. Doesn't mean one should lose hope, right? I mean, you still, you know, but I think part of it is there's work to be done, right? I mean, also when you get people into, you go to celebrities and they're in their fourth, fifth relationship, I mean, it becomes harder and harder just statistically for that relationship to be a successful relationship, right? Why? Well, that's a really complicated question, and I don't entirely know the answer. In some ways, people might be falling into the same sort of problems. In some ways, people might be experiencing the relationships as things they can switch up or what. But I think for the most part, it's, I mean, we have work to do, right? On ourselves and what we need and so on and so forth. How to not just meet somebody that's attractive and so on and so forth, but actually, like, what's your short list? What do you need your partner to have in a relationship, right? I'm the kind of person who needs, I mean, you'll have a list, I'll have a list, right? It's really important for me to have a playful relationship with somebody. So that's important, right? And I can't really do without that. But so there's this kind of, what are you bringing to your next relationship? People also pair themselves off, going back to your codependency a little bit, people pair themselves off, right? So we tend to pick people who are kind of reasonably similar sparring partners, right? I mean, you don't get somebody that's super emotionally sophisticated and they, for some reason, shack up with somebody that's really, really emotionally primitive and raw and not able to, I mean, sometimes we feel like we've done that. Oh, she's so, or he's so. But, you know, to be fair, you tended to get together in the first place because you kind of were engaging on the same level. Sometimes we outgrow each other, right? But so I think that becomes part of what you're talking about, where you end up in a similar sort of thing. But I think, you know, not to just always focus on the negative when it works well. And this is the third point I'm kind of making. You know, I think, you know, I'm a therapist. I train therapists. I'm a psychologist. And I'll tell you that I think the best kind of therapy is actually a really good marriage or committed relationship, right? I mean, so in some sense, it depends on how you think relationships are supposed to work, and we could debate that. But I think to some extent, you help grow each other up. So if there's some self-change that needs to happen for you, that I think it's okay for us to be doing that together. We each have our own work, and there's, you know, you might be helping her and she might be helping you, and you're both trying to be better. I don't think that's necessarily codependency, right? That is kind of, you're coaching each other.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a certain amount of healthy codependency that has to be present in a relationship.
Yeah, we could call it collaboration instead of
it's definitely, it's part of, hey, this is why we're doing this together. I want to be able to depend on you, and you want to be able to depend on me. And you know, the one thing I've noticed is a lot of people who experience trauma tend to they get together like, oh, you have that problem too. I have this problem
They're
too.
bonding over their pain instead of everything else they got in common. It's like, you went through what I went through.
Right. And then eventually it's like a scale. And that scale, when it goes up too far one way, the other one might run towards and try to save and help. That's what I've seen go on in our community and in my personal life, looking back in the path and talking to my therapist and figuring things out. I do have one other question I want to ask you. Like all your clients that you see, okay? Number one, do you see men handle breakups and emotions and mental health better than female, or would you say a female, and this isn't related to a relationship, do you think they handle it better? Is there a statistic out there on that?
Yeah, I couldn't. You know what? I'm gonna go out on a limb because I'm sort of guessing here, but I'm gonna guess and say, number one, that there probably is no statistic like that out there.
Okay.
I'm guessing that. But I also am going out on a limb, but I'm fairly confident this one, that there's going to be much more within group variation. Here, the groups are men versus women, if you're going to talk the two genders, right? There's much more variation within a group than there is between groups. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, so let me go to something totally different as an analogy, just so we're really clear here. Are men more aggressive than women? Well, on average, you could say yes. I mean, we could measure it certain kind of ways, but there's way more overlap between men and women than there is differences. So, you get, to answer your question, you'll get women lots of women who have much harder time than men, and then you get lots of men who have much harder time than women. There's so much overlap that talking about who gets over it better might not really be meaningful. You know what I'm saying? It's actually quite close. Another example is height, right? Okay, yeah. On average, men are taller than women, but there's so much overlap that I don't know, if we're talking about you and her, right? Not to make it personal to you. I mean, that's kind of it really depends more on the individuals.
Right. Got you. Now, doctor, talking about these people that have found themselves inside of bad relationships, or maybe they've bonded over their common pain, how often do you see that it's adverse childhood experiences that's really fueling the overall problem here?
Your question is how much
like within these inside these bad relationships, like the adverse childhood experiences are finding their way is one of like the major causes to people getting in these relationships in the first place.
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd want to say about that is it's not one-to-one. It's not you've had a bad childhood, therefore you'll have shitty relationships. I'm allowed to say shitty, right? I mean, that's not, I'm just playing. That's for sure not, we can't map it out like that. But, you learn how to have relationships, right? You learn how to have relationships. So if we go to an extreme example and we say somebody who didn't have any good relationships as a kid, well, I'm not saying they can't have good relationships. They can. I mean, in fact, that's what therapy is about, for example. You know what I mean? That's how therapy works to a large extent. If you've never had a good relationship, hopefully you're going to have a good relationship with your therapist, and now you got one of them. You see what I mean? And you're going to build from that. It's going to be a harder go. It's going to be a harder go, right? So I think we're all trying to learn how to have a good relationship. A big thing, to go back to what Chris was saying, but I think it kind of dovetails here is, do you know what you need becomes a really important piece here, right? Do you know what you need? When you're upset, do you know what you need? When you're feeling betrayed and you're innocent, like knowing what you need is not so obvious. I don't mean like I need a cheeseburger or I need you to do something for me. It's like, What do you need existentially as a person, right? To flourish, to work through this, to get over this, or whatever it is. And I think that's quite hard. So we do find things like, I'll call that emotional awareness, okay? If you go to stuff like, and I was saying to Chris, those stats, I'm pretty sure don't exist exactly. It could, mostly because it would be hard to measure. They may exist, it's just, what we do know by analogy, though, for example, is people who have, you were asking about people who have had bad childhoods is what you're asking about, right? People who've had bad childhoods are more likely to have unexplained symptoms later in life as adults, right? So people who were mistreated as children, physically, sexually, emotionally, they're more likely to have unexplained physical symptoms later, right? So you could say, oh, it's psychosomatic, or maybe it isn't, or we don't really know. So that there's that relationship. And here's where it gets interesting. The degree that relationship exists to the degree that people are able to be emotionally aware. We can measure emotional awareness, right? Some people are more emotionally aware and some people are less. Well, you know what? If you've had a really difficult childhood and for whatever reason, you're pretty emotionally aware, you're good at knowing how you feel, knowing what you need, then you don't have those unexplained symptoms. You see what I'm saying? So that relationship really only exists for people who have low emotional awareness.
Right.
So the good news here is another piece of information, which is, people who are not very emotionally aware, that's actually a skill. You can get better at it, right? You could get work on it. And that's why it's, people who've had difficult childhoods can have really good relationships later on. It's not a pin the tail on the donkey sort of thing, but it'll have to do with how much they've been able to do the work on their own in terms of becoming more emotionally aware, right? It becomes personal work.
Would you say it's fair that somebody who might have experienced some trauma as a child or an adolescent, as in with relationships, whether it be family or, a girlfriend or boyfriend, would be less likely to handle like a breakup well? And my reason for asking that is because, there has to be like a normal healthy phase of, let's just say today I start going out with a girl. A year from now, I break up. I know I've seen a lot of my friends in the past, like we'll go 2 or 3 years, like pining over that girl.
Yeah.
And in my head, I sit there and think, okay, well, there's got to be a point where you say, all right, it's been a month, I've got to, this is unhealthy. I either got to go seek help, or I've got to figure out, is this really about this girl? Are there other underlying emotional issues? What point do you think, if somebody's watching this podcast, should take a step back and say, you know what, it's been 3 months already. Am I on track, or is there something else going on here?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's tricky, right? It has a lot to do with how much you invested in the relationship, how serious it was, right? It's not that you dated a person for a month and then it's a year and a half later and you're still after the breakup, after the 1 month relationship. I mean, if you were with that person for 10 years, a year and a half later, and you break up a year and a half later and you're still thinking about the person, we would all say, oh, well, that kind of makes sense, right? So it has a lot to do with the quick index as well. How long is the relationship? But also, more importantly, in some sense, how deep is it? How important was it to you, right? So it's hard to say. I mean, often when people are talking about grief, this comes out in grief, right? Like say the death of a loved one, and the first year is going to be hard. But we're also talking about a loved one. We're not talking about the death of an acquaintance. We're talking about the death of a loved one. The first year is going to be hard for sure, but you got all these anniversaries, all these old reminders, trying to get into a new normal. But trying to get into a new normal becomes a key here. Like, are you trying to get into a new normal? Are you I think you have to, I was talking about death of a loved one, but we jump back to relationships. And I'm even circling back to something I said earlier, which is this idea that you didn't plan on having a relationship that would end. You planned on having a relationship that would work. So, there's going to be some grieving that has to happen. I think sometimes, in some sense, what you're asking, like, when are you stuck?
Right.
Is, that was actually the topic of my TED talk, right? It's like how to get over the end of a relationship. And there are actually these commonalities, whether it's grieving somebody who passed away, whether it's the breaking up of somebody you really trusted, a friendship, a confidant, or a romantic relationship, and also even relationships with parents that have gone sour, right? That maybe were related to abuse or that sort of thing. There are these kind of patterns. And the first one becomes, you're stuck if you're avoiding it, right? So I just don't think about it. Well, then it's going to be hard to get over.
Yep.
Right. The second one is, I think about it and I take it all to put it simply, I take it all personally. Yeah, you had something to do with it. You were involved in the relationship, but the fact that so-and-so wasn't able to love you doesn't necessarily mean you're unlovable.
Right.
And yet the person, it happens to all of us, right? You kind of get
Right.
twisted out of shape a little bit. So that's a different place somebody gets stuck. And finally, maybe they're through that, but there's still this last chapter, which is actually saying goodbye to the relationship, right? I mean, sometimes you had a lot of, I give an example in the TED talk of, you had hopes and dreams, things that you thought you would do together. If the person's pining over that, right? We'll go back to the friend example you used. The person's pining over, we always said we were going to go on that holiday, or we always said we would whatever, have kids, and they would be named this and this, because we fantasize about those things. There's nothing wrong with that. But of course, if the relationship ends, you got to grieve that. It's really, we have a good format in society. I don't mean any disrespect, right? When somebody actually dies, you put up a tombstone, and sort of that's a way of ritualizing the saying goodbye. But it's very hard to say goodbye to things that didn't actually happen. And yet people are still hooked on it. You kind of pine for, it's almost, you got to go through a process where you put up little tombstones to say goodbye to the things that you wished had happened, right?
Right.
And Doctor, how much different is this? And I found you because of that TED Talk, and I got to say, it was an amazing TED Talk. But I see this going on with a lot of the fathers and mothers in the group that have been inside of relationships that, their partner had an affair on them. So not only are you grieving the loss of that, but now you got self-esteem issues, you got betrayal, everything
so that's
along
that bent
with
out
it.
of shape part. You're like, was it me? Am I not good enough? I mean, it's normal that people would start to doubt themselves.
Yeah, and they hold on to that. They hold on to that for years, and understandably so. That's a big blow. I understand.
Yeah.
What would you say to somebody that's going through that right now?
Well, aside from watch my TED Talk, I would say, also a TED Talk is like 18 minutes. So you're trying to pack in a sort of thing. There isn't really a formula, but there are, which is the point of it. There isn't really a formula like, oh, if you got this, then push this button and everything will work out. And yet there are these kind of canonical, patterns, right? These pathways to working through that are seem to be more or less universal. That's what the research tells us, right? So it's not just me saying it or the internet saying it. So there's research showing that, there actually is a convergence in terms of the people who work through this. We could look at what they do, and we could look at what people who don't work through it aren't doing, right? And you kind of start to be able to tease out, oh, these are actually pathways, milestones you have to pass if you're going to work through this, right? So what we would say to somebody like that, I guess the first thing is, are you engaging it, right? In some sense, right, because some people are just avoiding it, right? The guy who says, I wish I had never met her. I wish if it's a guy, right? I wish I'd never met her. I wish I could just forget about her, and but you can't. It's not going to work that way. And also, you're pretending that you haven't lost anything, right? And so you actually have to grab the bull by the horns in some sense, right? You have to take it seriously and be like, okay, what do I feel about this, right? And if you're taking it in a way that there's kind of maladaptive emotion there. I mean, it's normal that you be angry. It's normal that you be sad. It's normal that but when you're angry, you have to know what you're fighting for. You can't just be, I want to break shit, right? You have to know what you're like. What are you defending? Is it your dignity? Is it that you're lovable? Is that you're competent? I mean, those are real things that people need, right? So I think there is kind of grabbing the bull by the horns is the first thing. And then, there's also knowing what you are feeling. How do you work toward that? I think people also get here's a real sticky spot. I mean, what you need, we're talking about emotional awareness and knowing what you need and being able to work on that to get that. It's not, I want to get this from her. What you need as an individual to flourish in life, or to work through this process, or to have a healthy relationship is something that could have come in the relationship, but it hasn't, because we're talking about a relationship that hasn't worked out, right? So, I mean, it's not tied to, it doesn't have to be that person. It would have been nice if she treated me like I was competent and worthy of love and those sort of things. But, you know, there are other people who can treat me that way because I'm worth it, right? I mean, so there's pulling apart, you know, you don't want to get too caught up in needing this from that person, but owning the need as something that's independent of the individual relationship. I think that helps people move forward.
Melissa Isaac in the chat has a question. Many men say they are unable to move on due to mixed messages from an ex-wife. How does someone move on when they must communicate with an ex to co-parent? How do you get closure when your lives are unavoidably intertwined by virtue of having a child?
Yeah, for
or children?
Sure. Or children, for sure, for sure. So yeah, I mean, this becomes a good example of a complex, complicated situation. It may or may not be complex trauma, but this is complicated, right? Because you can't just walk away, is what the writer's saying. You know, the issue becomes, what's a good outcome? What's a good outcome here, right? And I think, you know, because you're stuck in this relationship in some sense, right? You're stuck not necessarily in the romantic relationship, but you're stuck in having some kind of relationship because at least you got to negotiate childcare or whose turn is it now or whatever. Are we doing this together? Are we not doing this together? And yet we still have to, you know, it's like kind of, you still have business to sort out and you wanting it to be civil and you wanting it to be, I think, you know, you can think about, I think it's sometimes useful to think of like you get like a 2x2 here, right? Where it's like, I'm not suggesting you forgive people, but you could, right? So there's forgiving and there's not forgiving, right? Then there's reconciling and not reconciling. If you're not going to reconcile, certainly you can't not forgive, you can't forgive the person, you can't reconcile and not forgive the person. That's a terrible solution, right? That's people who hate each other and they still live together. That's a terrible solution. If you have kids together, you also can't not reconcile, right? I mean, on some level, you're going to have some sort of civil relationship, right? I'm not saying it's a deep understanding of each other, but at least kind of respecting the person's to some degree, right? It's to allow for the parenting. So I think we end up with something where it's sort of like, you know, I'm either gonna reconcile. There's often a sort of, you know, there's either going to be a reconcile and forgive, or there's going to be a forgive and forget sort of thing, where we're not going to have a relationship, but I'm gonna hold you accountable, and yet I'm going to allow for the ongoing kind of mechanics of the, you know, the parenting relationship. It's certainly very tricky, right? But I think that's what the writer's pointing out. Being clear about the kind of relationship that you're working toward, I think, is probably, if I'm going to sum up, right, becomes the key. Like, what kind of relationship are you working toward, right? And if it's, well, we're just going to have a good working relationship, well, then if you get a crazy email or something, now I'm inventing, let's imagine that the other parent you're trying to work with is stoking you and is kind of trying to, right? That happens sometimes. I mean, then you gotta be, what kind of relationship am I looking for? Oh, right, it's like the goal is just to be civil so that we can have a parenting relationship. And you're gonna have to scan through that and not pick up, because you weren't looking to be understood. You weren't looking to be cared for. You weren't looking to, you'll get that from other relationships. At this point, we're just looking for, right? So you don't end up putting fuel to the fire sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yes, sir. We got another question in here for you from Dawn McCarty. She said, can you explain how a child deals with the loss of a parent due to divorce that is still living and the actual death of a parent? In most cases, is there a difference to the child?
Well, I guess it depends a lot whether you're talking about the first scenario, which is loss of a parent to divorce, is like, how extreme is that loss? Are we talking about it's as if the parent were dead and they never see them again, never hear from them? Or are we talking about that there's a kind of a hostile ongoing relationship, the person's lost, but they're not really, they're still in their life, and it's a nasty thing? Or are we just talking about they don't live in the house, but you're able to have a good relationship, right? So that becomes pretty different. I think it's important for kids to have divorces. Nobody's going to say divorce is great for kids, right? And yet it's also terrible for kids to be living in a house, being part of a family where the parents hate each other. That might be worse, and then we could talk about, well, how terrible is this and how terrible is that? I mean, being around, I was recently in Norway because they invited me to talk to them. There's a group that works on domestic abuse, right? I mean, so like, I just thought of that's a scenario. I mean, that's terrible for a kid to be in the context of that. So yeah, divorce might be better for that kid, right? So I think, how it's going to impact the kid has a lot to do with what the state of the relationship is between people. People will have different opinions on what kids need. I'm reading the research, and from what I'm seeing, it seems pretty clear to me that what kids need are people in their lives that love them and that care for them. And they need to have a sense that the world is, sometimes people don't all get along, but our relationships are still, and I'm talking the relationship with the kid, is still gonna work, right? If that's a dangerous relationship, it could be emotionally dangerous or physically dangerous otherwise, then that's not good for a kid, right? So it's hard to know exactly what we're up against, sort of thing, and you need a specific scenario. Is it better to have one parent, or is it better to have two parents? Well, it's better to have, the more people that love the kid and are able to care for a kid, the better. Of course, if they're all at each other's throats, that's not so good, right, for the kid, because that's part of what they're living with. So
I know there might not be any statistics on this. I'm just asking for your opinion on it. But in a lot of the cases that you're hearing with relationships, the ones that are breaking up, what would you say is like one of the number one reasons that you're hearing? And do you think that most of these situations could be preventable?
The question is, what's the number one reason why people break up?
Yep.
Is that the question?
Yep.
Ooh. I mean, it's a good question. Is there a statistic? Yeah, I'm sure there is. Do I have it right now? Not really. But I also think I'm a little, because the reason why we broke up isn't always so clear, I think.
Right.
So we might want to be a little skeptical in terms of what that statistic is, right? We broke up because financial betrayals. We broke up because sexual betrayals. There's an infidelity. We broke up because we're just too different, whatever that means, right? I mean, I think I've seen people make their relationships work or not make their relationships work. I do individual therapy. I also do couples therapy. The number one thing that predicts whether the relationship is going to work is whether people want it to work. It's not really how compatible they are or how, right? It's like, do you want it to work? I think you could say things like sex and money are two reasons. If you want statistical reasons, that's probably near the top reasons why people break up, but I don't know if that's the most useful answer, because I think usually there's a deeper answer, which is much more important. If you think about the kind of fights couples have, I think a lot of people would say, in couples therapy would say that couples, really only have two kinds of major fights. I mean, you fight about the dishes, you fight about the garbage, whatever, whose turn it is to do laundry. But, the fight is actually about somebody feeling uncared for. It's like the "you don't send me flowers" fight. That's what I'm going to call it. Or it's a fight about power. You're not the boss of me. right?
Right.
And
Right.
so when I say that, then suddenly you realize the fact that somebody didn't do the dishes and now they're in a fight, the deeper issue could actually be somebody feels ignored, unappreciated, not cared for, or it could be you're using me, you're treating me like, you see, becomes a power fight. So I think, there's the stats reason, and then there might be the deeper kind of fights that people get into. Right?
How would you tell our audience who are watching to identify whether they're in a healthy or unhealthy relationship? Because let's be honest, in any marriage or relationship, you might look across the street at your neighbors and be like, "Look at them; they're outside holding hands, having a good time." But they have problems too. The grass is always
Sure.
greener on the other side.
Yeah.
At what point does it cross the line of being, oh, this is normal couple problems, or this is something bigger? Because it seems like in society today, we went from our grandparents, saying, oh, well, yeah, divorce, you definitely do not get divorced, to today where society is like, oh, well, you know what? You burnt my toast. This is over. What are your thoughts on that?
You burnt my what?
Burnt my toast.
Okay. Oh, that's a bad one. I think we do have to be careful about the grass is always greener. I agree with you. We do live in a society in North America, especially, where some people see relationships as, disposable in some sense. You can always trade up or sort of thing. There's an interesting, you want stats, right? An interesting, there'll be many things that predict divorce or predict a relationship working. One thing that doesn't predict divorce is education. So let me get to my point here, right? So it's not how much high school or how much college or how much, that does not seem to have a very good predictive relationship to whether this person will get divorced or not. But whether you drop out of high school or drop out of college, that predicts divorce.
Commitment.
So for example, somebody who finishes high school but never starts college is less likely to get divorced than somebody who finishes high school and did 1 year of college but then dropped out because it wasn't for him or her, whatever. So yeah, you named it. It's right. I mean, are you the kind of person who sees things through, right? Who finishes what I think that's pretty key. That's a really key thing. I mean, and at the same time, there are relationships that probably are just not healthy and shouldn't survive, right? So sometimes, right, abusive relationships that, maybe you got into the relationship at a moment of vulnerability, and this is not a healthy kind of thing to begin with, or any number of things, right? So I'm not going to say everybody should stay together. It's interesting that if you want to look at divorce rates, or jump to something really different, arranged marriages, right? So arranged marriages, right? The idea where, right, cultures where the parents have decided these two people are going to get together, and people in arranged marriages report the same levels of marital satisfaction as people who chose their loved partner. So what's going on, right?
Scary.
I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, it's curious, it's scary. Maybe it means it doesn't matter who you pick, but also maybe it really matters how hard you're going to try to make it work. You know what I mean? And I think I'm not perfect. And I'm pretty sure you aren't either. Do you know what I mean? And it goes on, right? None of us are. So then how much are you willing to forgive? How much are you willing to put up with? I think that how much are you willing to negotiate? And I would say, compromise sucks. It sucks not getting your way. I mean, it sucks. Why wouldn't you just get what you want when you want it all the time? We could talk about sex. We could talk about whatever, right? But at the end of the day, you're compromising with somebody. One of the reasons is because in the whole, you're getting more out of it. Do you know what I mean? It's more worth your while to be part of this than not be part of this. I think if you have the back door open all the time, it's hard to really commit also. So then you have that problem where you weren't really, oh, this is good for now, right? When are you going to go all in, right? And when you go all in, of course, that's really scary, because that's when you can really go broke. I'm talking about heartbreak here, but you know, I think your question of grass is always greener, going back to that, is the answer is something like, you know, it might look really great for somebody else, the couple who's always holding hands. But yeah, they probably do have their things. There's an old saying in Spanish. My father's Spanish. I have a Spanish family. And it's, you know, it's basically that you don't really know in English. You don't really know what a relationship is like. The relationships are like melons, that you don't know if it's a good melon unless you cut it open. Right. So only when you're in the relationship, only those people will know what that relationship is like. And I think there's part of it is are you willing to continue to compromise? Right. Being mindful of the fact that a lot of what a relationship is how much you get out of it. So, you know, I think it gets really complicated. I won't keep going, but I think it gets, you know, there's an extra layer when it comes to kids. I'm a dad. I got kids, right? So I think suddenly, you know, I had a motorcycle. I had a great life. And now that I have kids, I'm not saying everybody does this, but this is what I did. I sold my motorcycle. I had my second kid. I was like, they're really little, they're teeny. And I was like, I can't do this.
Right. Why?
I mean, other people are probably better motorcycle riders than I am. But I was sort of like, you know, my life was my life to gamble with. And now I have some responsibilities that I feel like I can't gamble with. So that changes it, right? So then we go back to relationships. Should I bail or should I stay with this person? I mean, once you put kids in the mix, it's more complicated. I think some people, my heart goes out to them. Some people are staying in relationships for the kids. And then I think you have to think about things we talked about earlier, which is like, what are your kids witnessing? Like, is it a loveless marriage? Is it a marriage that's, when I say marriage, I just mean a committed relationship, right? Is it a, you know, the kids are also getting an example of what a relationship's like. They're watching. Kids are watching. So, you know, there's this other kind of layer that where you're deciding this is worth it or not worth it. Of course, if I leave the relationship, well, it's not like the kids see something a lot better. They just, you know, they might have multiple families now, but, you know. Yeah.
Well, having all these parents in here, doctor, I mean, we know what they go through when you got to go through a divorce. Yeah. It's not a pretty process, and it costs awful, a lot of money. But would you say as a society, we have painted divorce as the quickest and easiest solution when we're having problems in a relationship?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking me you're asking me what society thinks?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like divorce sometimes becomes the quickest and easiest solution. And I would like to say, of course, you shouldn't stay in a relationship that it's just completely done. And I've seen people that have hung on to something that there's just nothing there.
Yeah. I mean,
I've also seen the relationship. It wouldn't have took much to put that back together, but they didn't try.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm not passing judge. Like you know, I could see it going both ways. And I think this is going to be really case by case. Right. And it's also going to be how much can you compromise? How much can you bend, right? How much can you make it work? And if you're seeing it like there's just two people, then maybe you're not, you know, there's actually a real, it's like two rings, right? There's a real overlap. There's a lot of we in this, and the degree to which, like, you change each other, right? If you're in a relationship long enough, you change each other for better or for worse. But you know, but if it's a good relationship, so some things are kind of crap and people stick around because they're hoping that they can, hoping eventually they can get it to work and we can kind of sync up, and, you know, and I think that's worth sticking around for. And yet at some point, I'm with you. I mean, I think, you know, is divorce a quick solution? I wouldn't say it's easy. I mean, anybody who thinks divorce is an easy solution, that's kind of the issue you're raising. I would say anybody who thinks divorce is an easy solution to all this problem, if they have kids, it's not an easy solution, right? Assuming you're not just going to walk away from the whole family. You know, if you don't have kids, I guess it's a bit different, right? I mean, it's easier to start over. You know, you might never speak to your ex again. If you have kids, you're going to keep speaking to your ex, even if you don't want to, because presumably you want to see your kids.
Yeah, you kind of got to.
And your kids need you, right? I mean,
that's right.
Yeah.
So, Doctor, you was telling me when I very first talked to you that you also have a podcast. Could you tell us a little bit? I love the name of this. Tell us a little bit about what you've got going on over there.
Yeah, well, we started that. It's called So You Effed Up. F apostrophe. So You Effed Up. And I started it, you know, the lead on that is Rob Tinkler. He's a screenwriter, actor, producer, and is an old friend of mine. And we kind of found ourselves having these conversations by phone, and we decided, you know what, because now we live in different cities. He's in Toronto, and I'm in Windsor, and it sort of became, you know, it's entertainment. It's but you know, people actually seem to, they write in and they sort of say, here's what I did. I effed up. What should I do? And that's the premise. So we'll kind of often just talk about, wow, you really did screw up, right? And in some ways, I think, honestly, I thought it would kind of, it was an idea that Rob brought to me and I thought was great. So we kind of go through this, and it's kind of like, I wouldn't say it's an advice column. It's kind of entertainment, but it's playing with it, right? What does it mean? What did you do? Where exactly did the screw up happen? And how do you fix it? And it's everything from, we got a letter from a guy who went on a date, first date, ends up at the girl's house, clogs the toilet and skips town, just leaves, leaves it like how it is. Like,
wow.
Yeah.
Chris,
that's a nightmare.
You did screw up. Here's what you should have done or what you should do now. To, you know, I was angry. I was yelling at my partner and I told him I wanted a divorce, but I don't really, but he's taking it kind of seriously. So yeah, that's a big screw up too. So what did you do now? You know, so then some of them are about work and some of them about family life. So kind of moving along.
You have any repeat callers? Like, hey, it's me, Bob. Guess what I did this week?
Not really. We do it mostly by email. It's by email. So people will write a little snippet and we'll kind of read, you know, anonymized version of it and sort of say, here's what the person, so it's not a live thing, but we'll kind of think about it and then present it. Yeah. Some people are probably writing in more than once, but I'm not sure.
Right.
What platform are you running that on? Are you on Google and Apple?
Yeah, that's on Google. That's on Apple. It's on everything. Yeah.
Awesome.
So you effed up. It's like
I like
one of these. Yeah.
I like it. And you wrote a couple of books too, haven't you?
Yeah. The TED Talk was about how to get over a relationship, but you know, that was kind of, some of the research from that is actually how to work through complex trauma. So I co-authored a book with Sandra Paivio on, in some senses, how to treat, it's a treatment manual. So it's not like an airport bestseller, right? But it's like how, explaining to therapists how to treat adult survivors of child abuse. People who have been mistreated, sometimes they work through it and sometimes they don't. And they carry that forward. It might be affecting their relationships or their parenting or their whatever. And that person sometimes comes to therapy. I mean, I find myself working super hard as a therapist, as a psychotherapist, when my clients say to me, you know, I was working with a guy who had suffered some of the worst things I'd ever heard of. He'd been to prison a bunch of times, you know, and I'm like, well, why are you coming for therapy now? And he's like, I'm a dad and I don't want my kid to be screwed up like how I was screwed up. And and that's the motivation. That my heart just kind of goes out to people like that. I mean, that's a different kind of motivation. But in any case, adult survivors of child abuse is a tricky problem to treat, because you can't change what actually happened in history. So how do you help people get over it? So we wrote a book on that. And right now I've been cooking this book for ages, but it's basically on emotional processing. It's when people say, oh, you have to process that emotion, or you have to work through that, or as if that were kind of like some good advice or an explanation, but actually you walk away going, okay, so how do I work through this? Like, what does this actually mean? So it's, and I don't want to dishearten people, but the researchers don't really know what it means either. So there's kind of this big hot mess, and my book is kind of on what is emotional processing. It's more of a research synthesis. After that, I'll probably write a self-help book, like an everyday version. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if somebody wanted to get a copy of your book, or if they wanted to keep up with you, where could they find you?
Well, I'm at the University of Windsor. You can always just Google me. TED Talks come up or whatever. My name, my book's on Amazon. Complex Trauma. Emotion Focused Therapy for Complex Trauma is the title. Very sexy. But technical sounding. Anyway, so yeah, Google.
Awesome. Well, Doctor, thank you so much for coming tonight. And guys, if you have not seen his TED Talk, please do yourself a favor and go check it out. I thoroughly enjoyed that. How long ago was it you did that TED Talk?
I'm surprised because what are we, April 4th? It's it has almost been a year now. I think
wow.
About a year. I'm going to say 1 year. And when I say I'm surprised, it's because I thought it would be, yeah, sure, I'll do a TED Talk. Why not? I'll do what I think is interesting. Maybe it'll be useful for people. I didn't expect it to get like 1.6 million views in 11 months, right? So it had a million views in the first 6 months. So I was really surprised how much appeal it had. And I guess, it kind of speaks to a problem that doesn't have a diagnostic category, right? Depressed, anxious, whatever. You don't have a diagnostic category for unfinished business. And yet it sort of really rings true for people. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, my man, thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend to come and talk to us and the audience, and everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Doctor, hopefully we'll see you sometime again in the future.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys, we will see y'all next time.